Hey everybody, we are going to move really quickly through our unit on intelligence. There's not a whole lot that is going to be heavily emphasized in this unit. It's pretty general and broad, not like some of the units that we've been looking at more recently with development and some very content heavy loads that you guys have been used to over the last couple of weeks. So, when we talk about intelligence, the whole idea behind it is that regardless of what culture you come from, it is the capacity a person has to do any number of these things: think rationally, use resources effectively, understand the world around them, be able to properly respond when challenges are presented to them. So, that's intelligence. I want to point out something very important. Note that it doesn't say anything about school smarts. That's really important to think, because most of us, when we have some level of mental concept of intelligence or some schema for it, we have this tendency to believe that intelligence is something that schools often attempt to improve and measure in some way. But it's really important to recognize that where research studies are concerned, intelligence is just whatever the test is attempting to measure. So if I'm trying to measure your artistic intelligence, that's all I'm measuring. It's not necessarily your school smarts. Although traditionally speaking, what has kind of pushed the development of intelligence tests or IQ tests has been that mentality of school smart intelligence. The problem with this whole idea of intelligence in and of itself is that a lot of people don't remember that it's just an idea. It's an abstract concept. It is a philosophical idea. It is not a physical thing. It's not a concrete piece of something that people have and are, necessarily born with specifically. When we think of intelligence as a trait, we commit an error that we call reification. That's when we view a very abstract philosophical concept as if it were something that were a concrete thing. So you got to understand, when we are moving through all of this, that the idea of intelligence is not so black and white as many people have tended to teach you that it is. There are two controversies that we're going to be taking a look at as we move through these video note pieces and finish up this unit on intelligence. And the first one is going to be whether or not intelligence is just a single overall ability, like an IQ test attempts to measure an intelligence quotient, or if it's multiple different abilities, okay? So things along the lines of Howard Gardner and his theories of the multiple intelligences. The other piece to keep in mind is whether it's possible to locate and measure intelligence within the human brain. Because with all of the modern technology that we have out there, many are wondering, is it possible to be able to physically measure intelligence, even though we just got done arguing it's an abstract thing. So despite all of that, those two issues, there is some level of general agreement about the nature of intelligence. So that's important to remember. The concept of a general, overall, singular intellectual ability first came from Charles Spearman. He argued that you have a general factor, or a G factor, for your mental ability. He didn't argue or deny, that some people have certain outstanding talents or skills or abilities, but he felt that those were differences between, all human beings, and it wasn't necessarily something that should blind us away from the possibility that humans have a singular overall general intelligence. Now, when we talk about this general intelligence concept, it's linked to clusters that can be analyzed by some level of factor analysis to create that singular underlying explanation to intelligence, that single overall ability. For example, people that do well on vocab would theoretically do really well on paragraph comprehension, or a cluster that revolved around you being able to operate on verbal intelligence. So other general factors include spatial ability. We've discussed that before as a right hemisphere dominant skill set, okay, your ability to recognize aspects of area and judgment of geometric patterns, for example, just spatial abilities, your distance between you and other objects. And there's also reasoning ability as well that go into Spearman's general intelligence quotient. Now, in the aftermath of Spearman and his argument of that general factor, someone named LLL Thurston came out and criticized him, saying that his subjects weren't necessarily on a single scale of general intelligence, that in actuality what he was attempting to do with those clusters was measure several kinds of what he called mental abilities. So Thurston is of the mindset that there's not just one singular ability, there's multiple. So you have things like word fluency and verbal comprehension, spatial ability like Spearman mentions, perceptual speed, numeric ability, inductive reasoning, and even memory. So he adds to what it was that Spearman attempted to analyze with that general intelligence idea. When in the aftermath of Thurston's theory is presented, the psychologists went back and took a look at it again. They found that there was a weak relationship between the clusters that Thurston emphasized. So, with that being the case, it did suggest there was some evidence in supporting Spearman's argument that we have this underlying singular intelligence that falls under any level of intelligence in general. So, there is some evidence out there to the possibility of Spearman's G-factor intelligence. Now, to add to this whole discussion of the types of intelligence that are out there is Howard Gardner. He very much supported Thurston's idea that intelligence comes in many, many different ways. And for him, it is not necessarily the traditional scholastic kind of intelligence that most people are used to. And it's Gardner's theories that are very, very heavily emphasized actually in education today, in addition to IQ tests or just regular standardized tests that you're used to taking for the end of an AP Psych unit, for example. He argues that brain damage can end up diminishing one type of ability that a person has, but it's not going to do it to every ability that that person has necessarily. So therefore, there has to be some other level of other intelligences going on in that setup. And he pointed in particular to people with savant syndrome, these individuals that had some developmental delays or issues with regard to their intellect. However, they had just off the charts numbers in terms of their abilities in other areas. They excel in abilities that are not necessarily related to Spearman's argument of that general underlying intelligence factor. So, he argues then that there are 9 different forms of intelligence. Each are essentially related to each other in some way, shape, or form, but they're distinct nonetheless. And so his argument is essentially, as this quote says, it's not how smart you are, it's how you're smart. So often when many of you guys will make comments to me about how you're just not smart enough, you just can't handle the class, this is why I give the response that I do to you, that everyone has different kinds of intelligences and different abilities that they excel in, and that you shouldn't just, automatically give up where school is concerned because you feel that you're not capable in that particular area. You're very, very capable in any number of them. So let's look at the varying different intelligences. The book is going to mention 8 intelligences, but I would definitely make sure that you're aware of the 9 that we discuss here. You have things like interpersonal, where you learn or have some level of ability to excel in collaborating and working with groups. You do really well with interacting with other people. There's the more traditional setup of a verbal intelligence, strength in written and spoken word, doing well in a typical classroom kind of environment. There's existential. This is a really interesting one I find pretty fascinating. That wanting of real-world connections. This is what we really try to provide to you guys when we do a lot of our application pieces of psychology, so that way you can see, all right, when we're covering these concepts, they really do have application to my life every day in the real world. There's bodily or also it's known as kinesthetic intelligence. You learn best through hands-on kind of tasks, and you can demonstrate your knowledge very well in those ways. There's musical intelligence, people who are capable of just absolutely doing well in music and writing their own music and playing multiple instruments. There are the naturalists who learn really well through classification and hierarchies, very similar to kind of biological structures. And they often end up being really good at picking up on subtle differences in those differentiations. So when I make you guys classify things, a naturalist would be able to see those small differentiations between two concepts that sound very similar to one another. Intrapersonal is different than inter, because this one is being in touch with your own feelings and wanting to know how certain things relate to you. This is another thing we try to do when we do our application pieces with you in class. So it's a little different than interpersonal, where you're good at interacting with others. There's visual, so you need imagery, maps, graphs, illustrations to help you better understand something. And then there's mathematical intelligence, just being really good with numbers and analytical problem solving. So these are the 9 intelligences that Gardner attempts to study and argue that everyone has to some level and degree. Now, to flip this into a different arena of theory on intelligence, we got to talk about Robert Sternberg. He's going to be someone we'll discuss in multiple units as we move through the remainder of this class. But Sternberg agrees with Gardner that everyone has multiple intelligences, not necessarily one just singular underlying intelligence. But he differed in the number of those intelligences. He argued, no, you've got 3 intelligences rather than, that should say 9, not 8. Again, I goofed on that because the book says 8 as well. So his argument is that if IQ rules, it's only because we let it. So we allow an IQ test to outrule, or that singular underlying intelligence idea overweigh any other kind of possible ability that other people have. And so we've got to get ourselves out of this mess that we've created of only telling you that you are intelligent if you perform certain ways on school type tests. So, what are the 3 intelligences according to Sternberg? You have analytical intelligence, so this is going to be based by traditional test assessments of intelligence. You have creative intelligence, so being able to adapt, not necessarily falling into traps of functional fixedness or mental sets. Being able to generate novel and new and out of the ordinary kind of ideas. And then you have practical intelligence. These are the kinds of intelligence pieces that go along with being street smart or common sense smart, okay? These are the kinds of intelligences that are required for everyday tasks for a person to be successful. So, with this in mind, then, we have some subsets of those 3 intelligences, combinations of these. And so Sternberg argued that there were 7 different kinds of people based on those combinations. You have people like the analyzer that does really well in academic environments, but they're not necessarily the most creative. So these are the people that have a tendency to, they do really well in school, but when they're given projects where they have to come up with their own ideas rather than being told what to do or what's expected of them, they struggle because they just don't have that creative gene, so to speak. You've got the creator who can come up with and generate novel ideas easily, but they have difficulty being able to analyze them to the point of being able to, say, put them into practice. So they can come up with good ideas or theories or concepts, but when it comes to putting them into practical use, they struggle. You've got the practitioner that's persuasive and can be kind of entertaining, but they lack substance in their thinking, so sometimes this can be kind of the class clown. You've got the analytical creator that's able to analyze the ideas that they've come up with, but they struggle with being able to communicate with these. Oftentimes you'll find this for people who perform fairly high on IQ tests. They're just incredibly smart and stuff comes very easily to them. But when it comes to being able to explain it to other people, they struggle with being able to make a connection for them. You've got the analytical practitioner that is good in a conventional sense of high IQ, but they are not likely to make a lasting contribution. So these are people who are very gifted and intelligent in that general sense of the G factor score, but they are not terribly good when it comes to initiative and making strong contributions to things. They can be kind of just sit behind the scenes and leave it at that. The creative practitioner, they have an ability to kind of come up with those new ideas and persuade people, regardless of whether the ideas are worth it or not. So a lot of times these are very charismatic individuals that make it to high levels of celebrity that can end up convincing people of the merits of their ideas, whether those are necessarily positive or not. And then you have the consummate balancer, which I think does a really good job within just the title of it of showing you that this is kind of the best possible kind of intelligence according to Sternberg. They're able to deal with all three: analytical, creative, and practical intelligence. And they do it in a very nice, balanced, even kind of way. So then we have emotional intelligence. This was proposed by Daniel Goleman, and he argues, he kind of takes hold of Gardner's argument of that interpersonal individual and takes it a step further and says that there is something called an emotional intelligence, not just school smarts, just a skill set that can be present in an individual that is important to recognize when it comes to being able to read people properly or interact with other individuals who might have different backgrounds than you. This is something that a lot of businesses in the corporate world are really trying to look for in college graduates, somebody who is good at interacting with others and able to express themselves and work well with those individuals. This whole concept of an emotional intelligence, or an EQ, emotional quotient, underlies this ability to get along with being able to show that you can deal well with other people. And so it's important to recognize that an EQ is, according to Goleman, just as important as an IQ. People who don't have strong IQs can still be very, very high in an emotional intelligence because they can read people and end up becoming very successful. Again, you can see this in terms of actors or celebrities. Many of them will share stories about how they struggled in school academically. They weren't the most successful in that arena, but they learned to kind of hone certain skills that they had in terms of acting or working with other people, and that enabled them to go far in their life. So you have four senses of, or components of, emotional intelligence. There's the ability to perceive emotion, understand emotion, manage it, and then use it. And so each of these, I think, are pretty self-explanatory in terms of their description. I don't really feel a necessity to harp on that or explain it too terribly much. It's pretty straightforward. The criticism of emotional intelligence to keep in mind is that Gardner and many others question whether we're stretching the idea of intelligence too far when we apply it to another kind of scenario of abstract philosophical argument with emotion. Because in a great many senses, it's not possible for you to quantify emotional intelligence. How do you assess something like that, and how do you tell whether someone has real strong intelligence quotient as opposed to, or excuse me, emotional quotient as opposed to intelligence quotient? So it's just really hard for you to test whether someone has an emotional intelligence or not. There's also been a lot of controversy that surrounds teaching emotional intelligence because there's a lot of argument that, particularly where intelligence is concerned and teaching aspects of emotional intelligence, many argue that it should only be taught, quote unquote, by other people than just those that you interact with. It shouldn't be something that is provided to somebody other than their family. So it's kind of a, what's the word I'm looking for? Character education piece. There's a lot of people out there who believe that schools should not teach their children character education, aspects of respect and things like that, that it should be the families doing that. So that kind of is a similar critique to emotional intelligence, that it's not something that should be taught by anyone other than a family member or families. So, intelligence and creativity. Let's kind of work our way back toward wrapping this up. Creativity is your ability to produce ideas that are novel, so by that we mean new and fresh and innovative and valuable. It correlates, note we say correlates, not necessarily a causal relationship, somewhat to intelligence. So they're related to one another in some way, but one does not necessarily cause the other. Intelligence doesn't cause creativity, and creativity doesn't necessarily cause intelligence. But there are several different factors that fall into things. First, you could have expertise. So this is your knowledge base, whether it's really well developed. You guys accuse me all the time of, always having an answer for everything in terms of what we do in class and why people act the way that they do. And I'm supposed to, because as a teacher of psych, I want to make sure that I have a really good background or knowledge base to be able to answer those questions and to tell you why we're doing things. So there's that real world connection. You also want to have imaginative thinking. This is an ability to see things in different, out of the ordinary kind of ways. This is something that I do not necessarily have a whole lot of. I was definitely one of those kids that fell in line with Sternberg's assessment that I did very well in traditional school settings, but if I was asked to go outside of the box and come up with creative ideas on my own, I could struggle sometimes with that. You have to have an adventuresome personality, so seek new experiences rather than just following the pack on things so you can come up with creative and out of the ordinary ideas. You need to have some intrinsic motivation. There's a vocab term coming back at you. You need to be motivated on the inside to create, not necessarily because someone tells you you have to do it. And you also have to have a creative environment around you. So creativity can be supported rather than just kind of suppressed or extinguished. So finally, we got to take a look at whether, or we got to look at this final debate that we mentioned at the very beginning of things on whether intelligence can be measured physically in the brain. Recent studies show some correlation. Again, we got to be really careful. This is not causal in terms of the relationship between brain size and intelligence. So the question we've got to ask then when it comes to this research is, does it mean that if you have a larger brain that you're smarter, or that if you are smarter then you will have a larger brain? At the end of the day, the answer to the why or why not is we don't really know, because just because there happens to be a relationship between the two variables doesn't mean that one causes the other to occur. So you can see in this visual of the brain through brain mapping techniques that gray matter, which is kind of a portion of the brain that doesn't necessarily have specific brain structural tasks, say like the hypothalamus or the amygdala, so it's not a specific structure assigned to specific tasks. Gray matter seems to be higher in concentration in people with high intelligence. But again, there's that whole aspect of the fact that correlation doesn't mean causation. So, studies of brain functioning show that people that score high on intelligence tests perceive things faster in terms of stimuli. They're able to retrieve things from their memory more quickly, and they do show stronger or faster brain response times. And so they do believe that that may have some relationship to the presence of having more of that gray matter, but they're not definitively sure one way or the other. So there's still a lot of research out there that needs to be done to determine whether it is neurologically possible to measure physically what intelligence happens to be and how it's present in a person. So this is the end of our first video on intelligence. We'll do a couple of activities together in class to kind of reinforce these, compare and contrast the theories and the theorists that go with them. But as always, if you have any questions, just feel free to let me know.